Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the last iteration of our discussions with professors or professionals in the political communication field for our ACS 411 analysis and communication. Um, uh, Today we are meeting with Professor Peter Lodge, and in very brief, because he will present himself to us, he's the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, Associate Professor of Media Affairs, and director of the project on ethics in political communication at GW, George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming and meeting with us. Full disclosure here, I have one daughter who's one of your students, Daria Anastasia, and she's going to graduate this January or December. But I think she took classes with you, and you gave her some recommendations at a certain moment. Anyhow, this is just a bit of trivia, but let's see. You look baffled, so it's clear.
Wa-
It's clear.
was my advice good?
Yes, yes, yes. No, you needed. She needed some recommendations to qualify for some things that she was applying. Now she's applying
Okay.
master degree and so on and so forth. So, anyhow, um, so I see here on the profile or the link that I shared with my students, just brief information about you. You have more than 30 years of experience in politics and communications, including a presidential appointment at the Food and Drug Administration and senior position for Senator Edward Kennedy, and 3 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. You currently lead the project on ethics in political communication at the School of Media and Public Affairs and continue to advise advocates and organizations. Well, you have a very long uh, bio here, so yeah, I mean, I don't hold it against you. Uh, People always tell me that I have a long bio, but I'm sure that I can't compare. So let's hear from you first of all.
Great. Thank you so much. I look forward to also finding out what advice I gave your daughter that she liked. It's always
Yes,
a little weird when people lead with that.
yes,
As you said, I've got more than 30 years worth of experience working in politics and political communication, work in senior staff positions for 3 members of the House, for a senator, and at the Food and Drug Administration at the end of the Obama administration. I should say I got your notes that you
yes.
emailed over and questions from your students. I should say I'm not a PhD. I'm a graduate school dropout. I have a couple of master's degrees, but quit at comprehensive exams because, as my bio indicates, I have an incredibly short attention span. I'm good at doing things for a few years in a row and then not. So, based on the questions and the time, here's my proposal, and you'll let me know if this works. I want to talk a bit about ethics and political communication and how
Yeah.
I think where we are and where I think we can go and some things we can do. Then I want to, which is what I do a lot of the time and what a lot of the questions are focused on. A lot of the other questions are focused on careers and what's happening in politics, my take on the election, all of that. So I'll also talk about that for a bit, and then just have a conversation. Professor, you can weigh in, or students, Ali, Cody, whomever can just weigh in, and we'll see how it goes. We've got it for about another hour and 10 minutes. Is that right?
Yes, yes,
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So, thanks again for the opportunity to do this. One of the few things that positive came out of Zoom or the pandemic was we all got more comfortable remotely lecturing, and I've had a chance to talk to more students and hear from more students in more places than I ever would have. So I definitely do appreciate this.
yes,
All right. Um, as I said, I want to talk about 2 sets of things. The first is ethics and political communication, and this is necessarily going to be short, but hopefully provide fodder for a bit of discussion. The first thing to note, I mean, this was not a fun election. Uh, and politics in America is not a tremendous amount of fun these days. I don't know anybody who works in or around politics who thinks, yes, more of this, please. I think all of us would like it to be better. They'd like the arguments to be better. They'd like it to be less shouty and more substance based. That said, it's also important to not be ridiculously nostalgic, right? We all tend to think that the world we live in is the only world that has ever existed, and that's simply not the case. all of you who are students have really only known a Republican Party led by Donald Trump, or Donald Trump was the driving force in the party. That's new, right? I mean, this is not the Republican Party that I grew up with. This is not the Republican Party that my grandfather, my dad's father, and as well as my mom's father were part of. This is not the Republican Party that my great grandfather was a local elected official in Southern California. It's a very different party, and politics is also very different in this moment. That said, the politics of this moment are different than the politics of the second half of the 20th century, but they're really similar to the politics of every other time in America. Nasty campaigns have been with us from the beginning. The campaign of between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams is notoriously vicious. It was notoriously awful. The president of Yale University, a guy named Reverend Timothy Dwight, said that if Thomas Jefferson were elected president, our wives and daughters would be subject to legal prostitution. The Hartford Courant from Hartford, Connecticut, which is a big deal newspaper at the time, said that if Jefferson elected president, the streets would run with blood. It's worth noting that Reverend Timothy Dwight also blamed an outbreak of yellow fever in the late 1700s on the global Illuminati. So even conspiracy theories about spreading of illnesses aren't really a new thing. The Adams made stuff up about Jefferson and had it placed in local newspapers at the time. Jefferson did not stoop to that level. He paid his friends to do it for him. The next Adams, who ran for president a number of years later, was falsely attacked for hiring concubines to hang out with Russian diplomats while he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, again in the early 1800s. This is kind of what we do and kind of who we are. Alexander Hamilton, who, in addition to being the subject of a famous musical, was, of course, a political philosopher and one of the architects of America's founding documents, was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, right? This group of basically propaganda advertising pieces in support of the U.S. Constitution, co-authored by Jay, Madison, and Hamilton. And in the first Federalist Papers, so the Federalist Papers were handouts, right? They were tacked to trees, handed on street corners. And it was an advertising campaign to get people, the colonies, to support the Constitution because the Articles of Confederation were failing so badly. And in the first one, Federalist One, Alexander Hamilton wrote, "Our further reason for caution in this respect might be drawn from the reaction that we're not always sure that those who advocate the truth are influenced by pure principles than the antagonists. Ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more laudable than these are apt to operate as well upon those who support as those who oppose the right side of a question. Whether or not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than that intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. In politics, as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution." He could have been writing about 2024. Instead, he was writing about the late 1700s and what was then the American colonies. George Orwell, who some of you probably had to have read in college or high school, or at least lied about having read in college or high school, wrote a very famous essay called Politics and the English Language in 1946. In 1946, things were actually going relatively well in politics. It was, you were coming out of World War II. There was a lot of, the U.S. was a rising superpower, were relatively held together relatively well. And in Politics and English Language, Orwell wrote that it's largely true that in our time, political writing is bad writing. It is largely in defense of the indefensible and meant to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. He also argued that there are a lot of overused phrases and words that are used so often that they've lost their meaning entirely, including patriotic, realistic, and justice. Those are the words he said were overused in 1946 and therefore meaningless. And these are the same things we're complaining about today. Fake news isn't new. In 1792, Ben Franklin, who, in addition to flying a kite in a thunderstorm with a key on the end of the string, apparently invented an entire edition of a real newspaper. So there's a real newspaper that actually existed. He wrote an entire fake edition of the newspaper in which he made up a story about how awful the British were in order to get European countries and American colonists opposing the Brits. right? So he didn't just plant a fake story, he invented an entire edition of a real newspaper in 1792. Sort of more recently than that, certainly, there was William Randolph Hearst, who was a newspaper magnate. Some of you may have seen, that's basically the name of the movie, but Citizen Kane is basically about William Randolph Hearst, very famous newspaper editor, and he very much wanted the U.S. to get involved in what became the Spanish-American War. And a U.S. battleship was sunk off of Cuba, and it's unclear what sank it at the time, but Orwell wanted it to be an enemy combatant who did it. And so apparently he told one of his photographers to go down there, and he said, "You provide the photographs, I'll provide the war." Again, well more than 100 years ago. The approach to social media isn't new, right? We think of politics being rainbows and puppies until Twitter and Donald Trump, and then suddenly the wheels came off. That is simply not the case. Social media is faster, bigger reach. It's different in volume, but it's not conceptually. It's not different than anything we've. In the 1700s in the colonies, the social media of the day were pamphlets. Printing presses were readily available. Not a whole lot of people could read, but enough people could read. You could have access to a printing press, and people would print pamphlets, then hand them out on street corners, or they put them on posts or things like that. George Orwell, again, really read him, even if you haven't, collected them. And in a book called Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn, a book about the ideological origins of the American Revolution, well titled, the author Bailyn wrote, "The pamphlet George Orwell, a Modern Pamphleteer, has written is a one-man show. One has complete freedom of expression, including, if one chooses, the freedom to be scurrilous, abusive, or seditious, or on the other hand, to be more detailed, serious, and highbrow than is ever possible in a newspaper or in most kinds of periodicals. At the same time, since a pamphlet is always short and unbound, it can be produced much more quickly than a book, and in principle, at any rate, can reach a bigger public. Above all, the pamphlet does not have to follow any prescribed pattern. It can be in prose or in verse. It can consist largely of maths or statistics or quotations. It can take the form of a story, a fable, a letter, an essay, a dialogue, a piece of reportage. All that is required of it is that it shall be topical, polemical, and short." You take out the word pamphlet and you insert the word social media post, and it's the same. Again, bigger reach, right, with X and Blue Sky and Instagram and the rest. But conceptually, it's the same thing we've always done, right? American politics has kind of been a hot mess from the beginning. That is not, however, to say that we should always be awful. Like the temptation to say, well, we've always been this way, so let's just get on with our day and go back to watching whatever, right? I don't take that perspective. I think political communication can be better. I think it can be more ethical. It can be more honest. And I want to talk about some of the ways I think that manifests and some ways to think about that. I've spent please.
If I can interject something here, because, my perception is a little bit different because I come from Romania. I came in the United States in 2003. I did my PhD in North Dakota, in Grand Forks at the University of North Dakota. And I was hired by this university in Illinois, though I live in Missouri, in St. Louis, in 2009. So, you are mentioning things of the past, but we have to remember that not so many people had the right to vote at the time, that only if you had land and property and you were a person of education and first of all,
Maybe a white male landowner who went to a certain church.
Exactly. So you had to be landowner and male and white.
And also, and certain religions were, states could bar Quakers from voting.
Right.
Quakers. Like, how awful do you have to be to hate the Quakers? That must be the kindest, most gentle faith next to the Baha'i.
I guess it's because of that, right?
I don't know how you hate on a Quaker. I know a lot of Quakers. Like, they're definitionally if you're mean and you're a Quaker, you go to Quaker Assembly and you just don't last because it's just too frustrating. Native Americans couldn't vote until 100 years ago. They weren't citizens, they weren't even considered people. And the argument from the colonists was rights are about property. Native American tribes don't believe in private property, therefore they don't get rights. which is an interesting logic train to ride, but it's one they rode. U.S. senators were not elected by voters directly until I want to say 14 or 17. They used to be elected out of state legislatures. So your senators from Illinois would not be elected by people in Chicago, Edwardsville, Evanston, Springfield. They were elected entirely by a handful of people at the Capitol in Springfield. Women, of course, didn't have the right to vote until 100 years ago. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 actually made sure that African Americans could exercise the right to vote that they had been granted in the constitutional amendments after the Civil War and right before Reconstruction. Jim Crow undid a bunch of that. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was meant to rectify that. 18-year-olds couldn't vote until 1971, I don't think. Until before then, you had to be 21. I live in Washington, D.C., downtown Washington, D.C. There are about 500,000 people live in D.C. Some of us work in politics and at universities. Most people work at hardware stores, or they're cops, or they're teachers, or whatever. People in D.C. couldn't vote for president until 1961.
Right. Plus, now we think, everybody has the right to vote if they are of a certain age, but it's not like that. Look at the expressed votes. Yes, actually, Donald Trump was elected roughly by 30% of the population that can vote. Right?
Right. So there's voter turnout, and we get even more undemocratic. We're drifting a bit here, but I think this is an important point to make. That
is a big problem for me in the modern democracy. If you have representation by being led by a president elected only by 30% of the population, then to me, that's not really representative democracy.
Maybe. One could argue that countries where you're mandated to vote means you've got a bunch of uninformed voters, and it's unclear that the outcome would change if they're mandatory voting. I do know there's an Australian journalist with whom I've worked a bit during the election cycle who was shocked to learn that people were allowed to not vote in the U.S. and then she explained to American citizens she ran into on the streets that you were required to vote in Australia, and they couldn't believe it. There's some other things, though, that make life even more complicated. I'm looking at some charts I have in front of me. Donald Trump received a plurality of votes in this last election, 49 point. I don't have the number in front of me. Basically, not 49.9%, so just a hair under 50%. And Harris got like 48 and change, so it's 1.3% difference. But Trump did not get a majority of votes cast. But he did beat Harris. In 2016, when he was last elected president, he received fewer votes than Joe Biden. The last Republican president before this week to receive more votes and get elected was George W. Bush in 2004. George W. Bush in 2000 lost the popular vote, won the Electoral College because of the state of Florida. The last Republican before that to get a majority of the popular vote and also win the election was George H.W. Bush in 1988. Because every state gets 2 senators, part of the deal our founders struck, Wyoming has as much representation in Congress as Illinois does. Right? And in 2024, as of November 18th, the vote count of November 18th, there are 40 in the next session of Congress. There'll be 47 Democratic senators and 53 Republican senators. That's how it played out. Tester lost in Montana. Brown lost in Ohio. So and Manchin obviously retired. However, so Democrats represent 47 seats in the U.S. Senate starting in January, but they represent just over 53% of the American people. So Republicans control 6 more seats than Democrats in the Senate, but represent 7% fewer American voters. So these are some structural challenges we have. But even in that, I want to talk about how we talk about politics and how we argue with each other about politics to get to the political communication piece of it. And the obvious thing is like don't lie, cheat, or steal. That's there's a recent Democratic senator from New Jersey, for example, who was invited to spend more time, really honestly, with anybody else outside the US Senate after receiving gold bars as payment. I mean, I kind of respect the old school gold bars piece of that. Like, that's good on you for doing it right. But don't don't accept the gold bars. Um, I've done this. I've worked in politics for a very long time. It's paid my bills for longer than any of you have been alive. And I've never been offered gold bars. If I had, I'm not sure I'd be on Zoom with you here. I'd be in the Caymans on a boat or something. But I've never that just hasn't happened, right? I spent a chunk of 2016 flying around the country with the Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We're meeting with industry executives, researchers, college presidents, things like that. And at no point did somebody come up to me and say, "Thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see you and the commissioner. This is really terrific. By the way, I have a medical device company, a device under review. It's stuck in the system. If you could just kind of look into that, that'd be great. By the way, is that your Gucci bag of cash you accidentally left in the corner?" That never happened. And that doesn't tend to be that happens sometimes. Again, gold bars. And I've got a former student here at GW who, before he came here, was a lawyer in DC, and he worked in the government ethics office in the District of Columbia, which is about as soul crushing a job as one can imagine. And at one point, he prosecuted a local DC official who'd accepted $50,000 in a coffee cup. So my question, which I'm sure is yours, is how big was that cup? Because 50,000 is a lot of dollars. I'm thinking like there's a big gulp, or like it happens. But usually what ends up happening in my experience in ethics and in politics is, I'm going to do this one thing this one time, but next time I'll get it right. Oh, my side is being a little bit undemocratic and this is really unethical, but it's okay because the stakes are so high. Or I would never vote for somebody who says or does something anti-democratic or undemocratic or violates democratic norms. My side isn't doing that. The other side is. There's a fair amount of political science research. As recently as earlier this year in the Journal of Politics, a really good piece in the American Political Science Review in 2020, and other places that finds that views of how ethical somebody's being, or if they're violating the Constitution, or if they're anti-democratic, is based largely on whether or not you share the political party of the person doing the behavior, right? So according to exit polls, a third of Trump voters said one of their top concerns was the state and the future of democracy, and they believed that Harris and Walz were threats to democracy. 2/3 of Harris and Walz voters said the same thing about Trump. I don't think either side was lying. I think they all believed it. But what we do is we tend to say, well, I'm good, just, and right. It's those other people. Or if I have to do this one thing this one time, but I'll get back to the straight and narrow next time. In my experience, that happens occasionally, but usually not. Usually you're one decision away from doing the right thing, right? When I was a chief of staff in the House of Representatives in the 1990s, and my boss was a Democrat, and we were elected with 50% of the vote the first time. My job was to get him reelected by more than that. And we kept we go to these meetings. If you work in the House of Representatives, if you're a chief of staff or a communications director or something, all these meetings about how to talk about stuff. These are the issues we're working on. These are the important things. Here's how to talk about it. And they kept saying, well, look, we know this messaging isn't exactly right, but we have to get the House back. Oh, we have to get more votes. Okay, I know this isn't just right. You're always one election away from governing. You're always one step away from doing the right thing. Right. And I see that playing out. So I think in the light of all this, so what do we do? Right. So politics has always been messy and bad. The president of Yale blamed the health outbreak on a pandemic, on a global conspiracy. People accused Jefferson of having fathered a child with one of his slaves. That turned out to be true. That actually turned out to be a true thing. But they're all like this mudslinging, this garbage, racism, the sexism. If there's a group in America, a group of people have figured out how to hate them. The Basques, the Chinese, Mexicans, Native Americans, the Irish, again, the Quakers. Like you've got to work to hate a Quaker. You got to put effort into that. And yet there's a group, we've found a way to do that. So my suggestion is a bit of a different take on it. And I'm gonna spend a few minutes on this before I sort of shift to careers and how politics works. Um, my view is that democracy and our representative democracy, as flawed as it is, as your professor points out, we aren't living up to the ideals expressed in our founding documents. The guy who wrote "All men are created equal" owned slaves. My view, though, is that democracy exists because we talk it into existence. Right? The founders didn't stumble across a box of democracy somewhere, right? When the Pilgrims came. I'm from New England. I grew up in Connecticut, and so Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims were a big deal, right? Where I grew up. They didn't like meet Native Americans, meet the Iroquois, learn about corn, and then they weren't handed a box of democracy along with the corn. We invented it, right? Our founders, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, Adams, all these guys said, we have an idea. And it was a crazy idea at the time that we can govern ourselves. That hadn't happened on large scales before. The Basques did it a bit in the Basque country in northern Spain and southern France. The Swiss did it a bit in the cantons. But the thing that these guys came up with was wild. And they're 20-somethings, right? And they invented this whole thing. And they said, I think this will work. We'll give this a shot. And they did. And it's gotten better because we've talked it better.
Well,
right? Yeah.
I think I can say in confidence that they didn't invent everything. They read a lot. They read a lot from the French revolutionaries, from
the French Revolution
Montesquieu, Rousseau, the philosophers,
Right. It was begged, brought, and stolen. It was, I mean, the French Revolution came after the American Revolution, so the French actually brought a lot from us, but we're all borrowing from Rousseau, we're all borrowing from Locke. The founding documents were rooted in part in Iroquois governance, how the Iroquois Indians governed themselves. Some of it was, again, taken from the Swiss cantons, which are it's as close to organized anarchy as you could get at that point. The cantons had a lot of autonomy. And I could talk at mind-numbing length about the Basques, but they're arguably the oldest people in Europe, one of the oldest languages in Europe. And there's a bust of John Adams on a major thoroughfare in the middle of Bilbao, which is this posh European city. The Guggenheim Museum and the Big Puppy are there. There's a bust of John Adams because John Adams, quite accidentally and against his will, wound up there while waiting for passage back to the US and learned about Basque democracy. So it was pieced together. And some of it was taken from Aristotle, and a lot of it was deals. But the US didn't exist before we talked it into existence, right? I was talking to a television producer from London right around the election, and he loves America. He loves America in part because it's just brand new. And he points out that recently in London, somebody's building a parking garage. They're digging out for a parking garage, and they came across a piece of a Roman wall, right? Like in Chicago, you're digging out to build a parking garage and you find Native American stuff or shards from the people going westward, right? The Mississippi Delta and the Mississippi River, you look down from your campus, right? And you're looking over the Mississippi, stuff will wash down again from like 100 years ago. You think, holy cow, this is how they lived 100 years ago. There's a piece of a wall built by the Roman Empire in a parking garage in London, right? The US isn't a church that got reinvented as a country. We weren't in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? This wasn't the Habsburgs' realm. This was a bunch of guys who were visionaries and utopians and slave traders and thieves and religious exiles and knuckleheads who came together and said, I know, let's do this. And we talked it into existence. And we've talked it better and better and better as we've gotten along. And it has been flawed and awful and a mess, but it exists because we talk it into existence. And Danielle Allen, who's one of my favorite contemporary philosophers, she's a professor at Harvard, chair of the Harvard Center of Ethics of something, something, something. One of these titles that sounds super impressive, you can never remember, but it's long and has people's names in it. So you think, you must be very smart. She wrote a piece in the Atlantic magazine a few years ago where she wondered out loud on paper, how could the great-granddaughter of someone who was enslaved be so loyal to America's founding documents. And our argument was that if you're mucking out the stable, I think this is a biblical reference, but if you're mucking out the stables and you find an emerald, you don't throw it away because of where you found it. You polish the emerald. And I think those of us who work in politics have an ethical obligation to do that. Democracy doesn't exist like the Mississippi River exists. Like you can go from campus to the Mississippi in a couple of minutes. It was there before Edwardsville. It was there before Sayou was there. It'll be there when you're gone. Democracy wasn't. We talk it into being. We have to remind each other that it exists. So I think part of the point of participating in politics is to win, right? I've helped elect candidates. I've helped pass bills. I've helped do all those things. I get paid to do that. But part of it is also an obligation to democracy itself, to the idea of democratic discourse, to the idea of debate. Late in life, John Adams wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson that reconciled. They were friends and they were enemies. They reconciled. And at the end of his life, in 1815, John Adams wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1815, saying, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war, that was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the hearts of the people. This was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. The records of 13 legislatures, the pamphlets, newspapers, and all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies." America exists because of political communication. Your obligation as people who participate in political communication, you write a social media post praising Donald Trump or condemning Donald Trump, or Pritzker, or you pick them. You go work on a campaign. You donate to a candidate. You be partisan, be sharp-elbowed, make your case for, whoever it is, Speaker Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives, or Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic minority leader, though. Make that partisan pointed case. Use strong and effective rhetoric. Draw on all the tools that Aristotle talked about in the rhetoric. Draw on all of that. And my plea is, in addition, do it in a way that keeps the debate going. Your political opponents are your opponents. They're not your enemies. I'm a Democrat. I grew up a Democrat. I worked for Ted Kennedy, right? Republicans aren't evil people who want to burn down the world and steal the souls of children. I think some of Donald Trump's cabinet picks are, I think he's casting governing with the stars rather than assembling a lineup of smart, effective officials. Some of them are choices any Republican would make, Kristi Noem, Marco Rubio. Some of them you look at and go, come on, like, is this season 1 of The Apprentice White House edition? What are you doing? But it doesn't mean the Republican Party is full of evil people. It means, I mean, for reasons that I don't fully understand, the Republicans nominated Trump instead of Nikki Haley. Whatever, we're moving on, right? The press isn't the enemy of the American people. Fox News, I think, does terrible things, but that doesn't mean you should pull their broadcasting license or pull them off the air. Come on. You got to have the conversation. They got to be part of the conversation. So I think part of our obligation, in addition to don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, if you're running in a political campaign, don't attack your opponent because of their race or their gender or where they're from or any of that kind of stuff, of course. But in addition, I think we've got a deeper ethical obligation to democracy and the democratic process itself. So that's that pitch. I'm going to leave that aside with an eye to the clock. And I want to talk about, that captures, I think, a bunch of the questions that all of y'all sent in. The other questions I'm looking at are much more career focused. So this is not an easy transition, but it's a one I'm going to make. And I'll talk about that for a bit, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. And this will be shorter because I'm much less comfortable talking about myself than I am talking about ideas. I've been super lucky in the School of Media and Public Affairs to work with people who you see on TV being interviewed or doing the interviewing. Some of my former students work in the Biden White House. About an hour ago, one young man was in here who's doing opposition research on the campaigns into the White House. The stuff you may have read about Republican senators taking credit for bringing grants back home to their districts and having actually voted against those grants on the floor of the Senate, and who those names were and how much money, that was my former student. Some of the stuff coming out about JD, that was him. Another one who was in here a week or two ago was deputy press secretary to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So these are those people. The my career is goofy and it's uninstructive. I grew up in a political town at a political time, got involved in politics. I volunteered in my first campaign when I was 10. I was one of those kids. No, I did not have a lot of friends. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was running for president. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia. And I dressed up as a peanut for Halloween and I handed out Carter literature as I trick-or-treated. Again, I did not have a lot of friends. I then went to college and I studied political communication. I went to study film. I was going to make movies, not films, but movies, right? I wanted things to blow up. That, it turns out, was hard. And one of my kid a year behind me won an Academy Award for editing Ford versus Ferrari. That's hard. I wasn't that smart. So I went to television. How hard could television be? One of my classmates created Will and Grace. Another was a senior writer in Saved by the Bell. Another won an Emmy for, of all things, producing The Apprentice. My alma mater is the Emmys are an alumni association meeting for my alma mater. So I couldn't hack it in television. So I went into politics because basically I washed out of, I couldn't keep up with a guy doing Saved by the Bell. I went to grad school. I stopped doing politics because I was kind of done, whatever, and I was going to be an academic. And I was at Arizona State University, not getting ready to drop out of graduate school for the second time. And a guy named Jerry Brown was running for president. Jerry Brown was the youngest governor in America when he was governor of California the first time. He was known as Governor Moonbeam because he wanted California to launch its own satellite. And this was in the 1970s. Now, totally makes sense. Excuse me, then in the 1970s, crazy idea. Didn't live. The governor has a mansion in Sacramento, California. They've got to get their own mansion. He didn't want to live in it because he thought it was pretentious. So he rented an apartment down the street and slept on a mattress on the floor. And so I was teaching classes at Arizona State, and I just told Jerry Brown jokes because they were too easy to tell. And I felt guilty. And so I called Jerry Brown's headquarters, presidential campaign headquarters, and said, hey, send me some information. I should learn about it. And they never sent me anything. So that led to more jokes. Then I got a letter saying, do you want to run as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention for Jerry Brown? I thought, sure, I've never done that before. But then I felt guilty again. I thought, oh, I should probably volunteer. So I called the Democratic State Party headquarters in Arizona and said, put me in touch with the person running the campaign. And the person and I had coffee. She said, do you want to be the state director for Jerry Brown? Sure. I'd never run a presidential campaign before. How hard could that be? So I completely fell face first into politics. And since then, I've just said yes to things I had no business saying yes to, and accidentally wound up in a really lucky career, which is not at all helpful to any of you. If you want to get involved in politics, do. I think it's exciting. I think it's fun. It's stressful. It's maddening. It is unglamorous. It is not well paid. If you want to get rich and famous, there are far better ways to do it than to work in politics. But I also feel really privileged to be born into the United States of America in the last quarter of the 20th century, when democracy was doing reasonably well, and have the opportunity to say, yeah, some middle-class kid from New Haven, Connecticut can do a thing. Okay, that's pretty cool. I believe deeply in the promise of this country. I believe deeply in the emerald that was in the stables, and I know very well its flaws. So I encourage you to get involved, left or right, whatever. I care because I'm a partisan, but mostly I care that you're engaged. And the way to get engaged is to find something or someone you believe in and show up and keep showing up. And it could be Pritzker. It could be a city council member in Edwardsville. It could be the mayor of wherever your hometown is in, I don't know, SIU has people from all over the country and all over the world. Redlands, California, Hartford, Connecticut, wherever it happens to be. Show up and keep showing up. Be curious, be interested, be engaged. And that's all I've done. Think critically, communicate clearly. And focus, my plea is, as you do, focus on the promise of a country in which you want to live. And part of that's the moment. elect your candidate, pass the bill, get people to do whatever it is you want them to do, but do so not in the service of the election or the vote on the floor of the Illinois State Legislature in Springfield or Congress in Washington, D.C., but do so in the service of a promise of a set of ideals up to which our country has never lived, but towards which we should continually move. Right? This is Barack Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention in 2004. This is Kamala Harris at the convention in Chicago. This is Ronald Reagan's talking about a shining city upon a hill, which is a line he took from a minister on one of the ships sailing to what became the American colonies. It is a promise of what sociologist Robert Bellah calls a civil religion. And as long as you're engaging in good faith in a promise of what our democracy can be, and you're working your ass off, you're going to make a difference. And you can make a difference. And if you don't, somebody else is going to. Right? Politicians look at all sorts of structural things, gerrymandering and money in politics, and all those things are true. I can tell you, having, again, worked for 3 members of the U.S. House, a U.S. Senator, and the commissioner of the FDA created a role for me. I have been lobbied by the best. The people I always want to listen to the most are the people from the hometown with a story to tell. Right? So come in and tell a compelling story. Tell me how I can make your life materially better. Make a case for that which is more just, more honest, and more true, and we'll find a way to work on it together, and it might work. Last plea on this, again, I'll get back to the ethics piece, I guess, and then I'll open it for discussion because I'm talking too much. I work on the political left. People quote, a quote that's often used on the political left is the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice. And they tend to focus on the bends towards justice part. Aha, we want a big win for marriage equality or for voting rights or whatever. Aha, bending for. They tend to leave out the long. It is really long. It is hard work, it is grueling work, and there are endless setbacks. Politics is for the patient. Impatient in the moment because it moves fast, it's super competitive. My 2 obsessions are American politics and soccer. And one of the reasons I like elections is because the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, they're over. One of the many things I like about soccer games is they're 2 hours long. 2 45-minute halves, you get a halftime. That's it. I show up at Audi Field to watch the really, truly, profoundly bad DC United. At kickoff is at 7:30. I'm walking out the door at 9:30 thinking, I can't believe I bought season tickets again. I'm in bed by 11, cursing everything. And I am up to kick off my Sunday morning pickup game by 8 o'clock Sunday morning. And I'm home by 10. Like that's politics. But it's also this other deeper thing. Believe in the deeper thing. And I'm rambling. Help me out here, Professor. So I talked at you nice people now for 44 minutes.
I was thinking you are the advocate in being so proud of being from here and fighting for the democracy imagined here, but you are using an example from soccer, which is from Europe and not liked by many people in the United States.
I am picking that fight with you. It is liked by, have you not? Yes, it is. It is popular in the United States. It is, yes. Interestingly, the most followed national team in the U.S. is actually the Mexican national team. It is easier to watch Premier League games in the U.S. than it is in the U.K.
Yeah.
Soccer bars here are packed. One of the challenges with pickup soccer in Washington, D.C. is there are too many people who want to play it not in the fields.
Yeah.
But yes.
They built a soccer field here in St. Louis. They hired international players and they lose the games all the time.
Because it's in their first or second year of the franchise, and some great American players have come out of St. Louis.
That's true.
Brian McBride, pride of St. Louis.
Yes.
Great American player. Scored a legendary goal when he was at Fulham. They were playing Chelsea. And McBride's this big he was a towering center forward, goes up for a header, slashes his head open, taken off the field, bleeding profusely.
Right.
Fulham is playing man down against one of the best teams in the world at that point, Chelsea, or Chelsea, depending on how you feel about Roman Abramovich owning the team at that point. And you think you got to sub him. They stitch him up. They glue it, literally super glue part of his head back together, wrap him in bandages, send it back on the field, and he scores the winning goal. Brian McBride of St. Louis, Missouri.
So
Just saying.
it looks like in soccer, like in democracy, the arc of being better is long, right?
It's like,
Right.
and it bends towards money.
Right.
Just ask the owners of City.
Yeah. Well, again, being an initial foreigner and a perennial immigrant, um, I want to ask you, the United States is actually a little bit late at this game of becoming totalitarian. After some things moving on in Europe, but also in the Philippines, in India, in Brazil, and so on and so forth. But now, the United States was perceived always as you know, the force, the military force and political force in the world that was keeping the world in balance. Because remember, after the Soviets fell at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, there was this sentiment that the United States is the only force in the world and it's a force for peace and for
Yeah.
democracy. But then the United States was involved in so many, abnormal wars that proved to be more like for resources and for somebody's interest rather than the interest of the American people. Lots of money and the trust in politicians was lost in those attempts. Then 9/11 attacks, people were like, why are they attacking us? But nobody remembers what happens, what is left of the Middle East now after so many military involvements. But I can tell you, I'm from Romania. I have relatives that are trying to revive what was happening 100 years ago in Romania under the influence of the Nazis.
Yep.
Militarized political parties that advocate for, using force if something is not going the patriot side
Yep.
for the interests of the Romanians. So you see, the globalism for the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s was the word of the day. And there were certain levers at the political and economic level internationally that were forcing these countries into submission. Former communist countries in the former Warsaw Pact were told, and I worked for the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education of Romania in public relations and international relations. And we had a subcommittee or group that was working for the integration of Romania into the European Union that came actually very late for us in 2007. But we became a part of NATO earlier. So at that time, it was always this kind of pressure, hey, do this for democracy and for globalization and for integration in the European Union, meaning integrate your markets,
Yep.
transform your what it's called in French acquis communautaire, the corpus of legislation that was supposed to be aligned with the legislation of the European Union, open your markets, make your workforce more mobile, reinvent yourselves, and so on and so forth. For 10 years, there was huge inflation. For 10 years, we were buying the used cars from Western Europe, and Western Europe was also happy with us. After that, when 1 million people immigrated to Spain because they are Romanians and it's Romance language and it's easy to understand, and the million other people went to France and the million other people went to Italy, the Romanian population is depleted of its brains because only the smart people left, you know.
Yeah.
So now everybody else is told, hey, now it's nice to think only about America. The Brits should think only about Britain. The French maybe should think only
So,
about French people. So Romanians are starting to think only about Romanian people. But what will the future be? Because we will be again at loggerheads and we might be in the brink of a world war again.
uh, I was with you almost all the way. One argument is neoliberalism, and I've got a colleague here who thinks that neoliberalism broke the world. And I mean, maybe it did. I don't know. But it's also the case that Franco's plea or Franco's charge in the 1930s in Spain was Spain for the Spanish. And you had a disgruntled former general, largely living in exile from a poor part of the country, who got a bunch of out of work, underemployed farmers and factory workers angry at the intellectual and cultural elites of places like Barcelona. We're going to march against them and we're going to take our country back. And this was in the 1930s. Franco hated the Basques in part because he wanted to ban the language. And the Basques were like, look, you can do what you want to do. We're going to cut a deal the way we've been cutting deals with everybody since pre-Roman times. And Franco tried to bomb them out of existence, banned their language and banned their culture. Again, 1930s.
Also, the Germans used their carpet bombing aviation for the first time on Guernica.
And, I was about to mention.
Also, the Soviets sent their groups of fighters to try their weapons in Spain.
Because the Spanish promised them gold. This good Soviet empire that was going to bring the workers' revolution was happy to sponsor a revolution as long as you paid him to do it. The deal Franco cut with the Nazis was, I will let the Luftwaffe practice on Market Day in Guernica. So Italy for the Italians, right? Donald Trump in many ways, I think a good parallel is Berlusconi. You have Le Pen in France, France for the French, and this predates Brexit. Yes, all of those things are true. It is also true. Do I have permission to share my screen? I'm gonna share my screen for a second.
I think you should have, yes.
There we go. Yeah. So I've got to give a presentation tomorrow to the Emeriti faculty of George Washington University. And a couple of things I think that are worth noting, at least in this context. You may have seen this chart from FT. These data are a few days old, but every incumbent party in the developed world lost vote share in 2024. All of them. This little red dot is the US. This is everybody else. Everybody has moved to the right. One of the last holdouts in Europe is Spain. And that's a fragile deal that's not going to hold because the socialist president only won by basically persuading people he wasn't going to cut a deal with a Catalan separatist who was wanted in Spain serving the European Parliament so he could serve in the European Parliament, but actually wasn't allowed in his home country. In order to construct a governing coalition, the president had to cut a deal with a separatist, so he's going to lose power. This is everybody. Right, I've lost my cursor. This list is everybody. In London or in the UK, voters moved to the left. They threw out the conservatives. In the US, we have moved to the right. This is the how much Harris underperformed Biden in every battleground state. Harris's margin versus Biden's margin. Right. So Harris got 1 million fewer votes in New York than Biden got. This is a map from National Public Radio as of a few hours ago. Places that move to the right. This is Los Angeles. You expect parts of Texas to move to the right. Los Angeles is moving to the right. So I'm having to move stuff around on my screen here, so this is a little bit awkward. New York, virtually every part of New York moved to the right. Massachusetts, everybody moved to the right. So yeah, this is happening. Stop sharing. But I also think that we talked our way into this. And I think we can talk our way out of it. You know, robust democracy is important. Partisan debate is important. Partisan poisonous debates have been part of American democracy from the beginning. We have been intolerant, insensitive, racist, sexist, genocidal from the beginning. We've seen this movie before. And the good news is, so far, this movie has always eventually ended in democracy. Eventually, we've gotten more democratic, not less. Right? I get really frustrated with my Democratic and liberal friends who say, oh my gosh, all those knuckleheads, those knuckle-dragging Cro-Magnon idiots have taken over. We're doomed because the stupid people are in charge. One, they're not stupid. You know, a lot of people in the US looked around at politics and said, you know what, stuff isn't working. Gas and groceries cost an obscene amount of money. Gas is more expensive. Groceries are more expensive. You all have student loans, right? Edwardsville does a much better job of making college affordable than a lot of other universities, certainly across the state of Illinois, right? Talk to your classmates who went to the University of Chicago, for example, or Northwestern, or, if they went out of state to some of the more expensive, where I teach, it's obscenely expensive. Of course, they're looking around saying stuff's broken, right? They're angry, they're frustrated. So I get it. So let's talk our way back to a better place, right? Because the alternative to democracy is throwing rocks at each other. That's not sustainable and it hurts. So let's avoid that. Let's at least get back to arguing and argue better. And yes, I'm anticipating your questions. Yes, inflation is coming down. Yes, the US economy is the envy of Europe. That's front page of the cover of The Economist. Yes, gas and groceries cost less than they otherwise might have. Yes, wages are up, unemployment is down, the markets are up, right? All of those things are true. But every time I put gas in my car, I think, holy cow, gas costs a lot of money. And I don't drive very much. I walk to work. Every time I go to the grocery store, I'm about a block and a half from the grocery store. I think, are you kidding me? I'm paying what? Right? Yes, Republicans help break it. Like, one of America's concerns is immigration, as it is globally, right? Not just in Romania for the Romanians, but you look at how England is handling migrants, the Basques are doing a better job than many because it's a pain in the ass to get to the Basque country. It's just easier to get to Marseille than it is Bilbao. All of those things are true. Yes, there was a bipartisan border bill that Trump had his supporters tank, and he helped create the chaos that he is now claiming to fix. All of those things are true. Nevertheless, we talked our way into this position, and I think we can talk our way back.
Okay, I need to stop you here, and let's see.
Thank you.
Some of the questions of the students, because it's almost 12 o'clock here and almost 1 o'clock for you. I'm just reading here through some questions, and because you went through look at the first student, Ines Chakir, who's actually a student from Northern France who's studying a semester at IUE. Let's see the second question, because you discussed a lot about ethics. You have worked on groundbreaking, like putting let me read
so
it.
I think
The student.
I got it. Yeah.
Let me read it for the students so they can hear it.
Yeah.
You have worked on groundbreaking initiatives like putting members of Congress online. How do you see the ethical responsibilities of political communicators evolving as technology continues to reshape how campaigns are conducted?
A good and reasonable question, and one I get a lot. I think the answer is your ethics shouldn't evolve. You should have an ethical position. Be who you are in the world. All right. When I started the project on ethics and political communication, initially it's going to be the project on political communication ethics. I mentioned at a faculty meeting, doing this thing. One of my colleagues said, you don't have political communication ethics, Peter. You have an ethical foundation that you apply to politics. You don't have classroom ethics and family ethics and work ethics. You are who you are in the world. You try to be a good person in the world. Bring that to politics. Bring that to digital media. Treat digital media the way you would print or knocking on somebody's doors or making phone calls. Right. And what we've seen with tech in this election is specifically with AI, right? Because that's what everybody's talking about. There are two kinds of AI, predictive and generative. Predictive looks at big data sets and helps you manage data and make predictions. Waze does that. Like, that's how you know to avoid traffic jams. Generative AI is drawing pictures. Predictive AI has been part of campaigns for a while. It helps figure out where your voters are, who's going to donate, how much they're going to donate, that kind of stuff. Treat that research as you would any other research. Treat people with respect their privacy, all of that. Same as voter lists or mailing lists or phone lists. On the generative side, we have seen generative AI used in this campaign mostly to write fundraising emails. All the fundraising emails or texts you're getting are not actually being written by Barack Obama. Some of them are being written by interns. Many of them are being written by bots. Generative AI is writing first drafts of speeches, first drafts of talking points, first drafts of mail. The final draft is being written by people, in part because people are better at it. They're more creative. Generative AI is a status quo machine. It can't do the surprising. The best comms is more creative than that. The other reason is nobody wants to get caught, and some people have been caught. There's a sheriff in an elected position, an elected sheriff in Philadelphia, who posted stories on their website from real newspaper outlets, real media outlets. The stories themselves were entirely fabricated. The sheriff wasn't well liked. the sheriff invented fake stories about themselves from real media outlets. And it turns out they were AI generated. The problem with that isn't that they were AI generated, it's that they were lies. Had an intern written them or the person written them, they would still be wrong. Again, however, deep fakes, as opposed to, I don't know, shallow fakes, fake, I don't know, pretend like fiction is fiction. And again, it's been part of the US for the jump. My favorite example of this is, I don't know if any of you are history fans, but there's a movement in American art called the Hudson River School in the 1800s. And a lot of painters, many from Europe, went to the American West, what was then the undiscovered American West, right? Bear in mind that where you're living used to be the frontier. So then they went even further and they painted these massive landscapes. Like I'm doing the big hands thing because it's actually they're massive. And they would be unveiled, right? There would be seating. People would set up theater seats and a big curtain. You'd unveil the painting. And they were unveiled on the floor of the House of Representatives to present the awe and grandeur of the Grand Canyon and what is now Yellowstone and all of that. The problem is a lot of those painters didn't paint what they actually saw. What they tried to do is present visions of Eden. They inserted geography. They had light going where light wouldn't go. They were, if you look at the Museum of American Art, where a lot of these are hanging, they're described as composites, which is to say they're deep fakes in oils, and they led to the national parks.
Yeah, no, don't forget that is, artistic license. When
yeah, it's artistic license if it's doing something you like. If it's doing something you
Yes.
don't like, it's a deep fake.
Yes.
So, I mean, for me, online digital ethics are ethics.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. It's just that in politics, you work with real people, and it should be real politics rather than fake politics.
So we used to call it Photoshop. We're going to Photoshop people together because there's a computer program called Photoshop. When I was a kid, before computers, which is alarming, not before computers, but before widespread adoption of computers, it was cutting and pasting. And you would literally cut things out and you would paste them. Like faked photographs are Ansel Adams, great American photographer, did his best work in the darkroom. We've been faking images to advance political agendas since we began creating images. Yeah. It's faster, it's easier, wider spread. Yes, social and digital makes it bigger and louder, but the premise is the premise. Don't lie, visually or in writing. Just don't.
Yeah, it's just that you see when you
thanks, Ellie.
when you prep the public for to perceive certain minorities, for example, in a certain way, telling them they're eating your cats, they're eating your dogs.
Yes.
After you get those people are scared that you're going to send the people to exert revenge against them.
Right. Don't do that. That's not a tech question. That's not an internet question, a generative AI, open AI question. That's a don't do that thing. Just as we did with the Chinese and the Chinese Exclusion Acts, just as we did in the US when we rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in camps during World War II. You can look at political cartoons from the 1800s and they are awful racist stereotypes. It's easier to generate them now with free software. Yeah. You still shouldn't do it.
And you saw it was the same for the Brits recently when they heard, somebody in a certain neighborhood in London or somebody or killed somebody, and they went to, like a mob to lynch them. It's like in India, the Hindus against the Pakistanis,
Right.
And like
again, that's not a tech thing. It's a please stop being a racist thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's read the question now from a graduate student, Julia Donato. Given your experience in both academia and practical media strategy, how can political campaigns effectively balance transparency and strategic messaging without crossing ethical boundaries, particularly when facing a crisis or public backlash?
That's a really good question. And this gets close to what you have to do day to day in campaigns. You're never telling the whole truth of anything. You can't. If you're a media effects fan, this is framing. If you're a semiotics fan, or if you come out of rhetoric, it's a kind of Berg thing. If you come out of semiotics, it's a linguistics thing, a bit of Derrida. But you can't fully ever describe anything because most things are a lot of things at once, right? The death penalty is about the moral retribution of society. It's about allocation of resources. It's about innocent people on death row. All of these things are true. What you want to do as an advocate is figure out the angle of a thing that's true and works to your advantage. If you do that, then you have to be transparent in that. Sorry. I want little peanut dust in my throat. You've got to advance it in a way that's honest, but tell the truth, but not the whole truth. Tell, you know, I think you have to omit something, so you want to strategically omit things. But I think where your ethical line is your call. I mean, like, don't lie, don't be a racist. Got it. But beyond that, most of the interesting stuff is in the gray. So my strong advice to any of you who go into politics is figure out why advocacy. Like what is that world you want to be in or live in? What draws you to advocacy? What's your ethical and moral foundation? Where do you come from? Right? Just the really deep, big think stuff. If it's, the Gospel of Paul, if it's the Torah, if it's a children's story, if like whatever it is, what's that thing? And then always remember that, and then also write down, you can't think about it all the time because it's hard and it's time consuming. But then what are the 1, 2, or 3 bullet points that help you remind that, right? What is the tether? What's that constant reminder? And put that on a Post-it note, put it in your bathroom mirror, or put it in your wallet, right? If it's, what would my grandfather say? I have a former student who's a big deal Republican operative. And for her, that's it. Her grandfather fled Castro's Cuba. What would Abuela say? And if her abuela would say something, that's what she would do. What is that touchstone? And then don't cross that. Because the moment you cross it, it's really easier to cross it again and again and again. I would encourage it, like you're paid to win, you're paid to be an advocate, but never at the expense of undermining democratic norms and democratic values for which you stand. Like the next election is not worth your soul.
Okay. Let me try to cover at least one question from the students who took the pain to be present today. And
the pain. Emily does not look pain.
In the sense that I have 14 students and I see now only 4 online. Well, the others will for sure see the recording. But look, a question from Cody. How do you think RFK Jr. will impact the Health and Food Administration?
Yeah. The good news is he's probably incompetent. So I worked at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I worked on the Affordable Care Act. I worked for Ted Kennedy. My lovely young wife is a public health policy expert and the vice chair of the Department of Health Policy here at the George Washington University. My brother-in-law is the number 2 lawyer at the FDA. The commissioner of the FDA is a friend of mine. This is one that I think a lot of what RFK Jr. has to say about overprocessed foods and we shouldn't eat as much junk food is like, that's true. I tend to agree with a lot of that. Vaccine hesitancy. I don't know what that means. Like I'm hesitant to, step off a height. I'm hesitant to go out on a storm. I'm not hesitant about banning measles shots. I'm terrified of that. But he simply doesn't believe the science. And I think that would be tremendously, tremendously dangerous. He also thinks 5G is somehow messing up our brains and that airplane contrails. He has this weird spaghetti sauce view of public health. So most of the agency's work, Health and Human Services is a very large federal agency that includes the FDA, the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, and others. And most of the work is not done by the secretary or the commissioners, right? The head of the CDC, FDA, NIH. It's done by political appointees below that and then career staff below that. And a lot of what RFK Jr. wants to try to do, they simply won't do or they can't do. But what he can do is direct attention, time, and money. And if he raises doubts about whether or not vaccines work for children, fewer parents will vaccinate their children and we'll see more measles outbreaks. Children will die.
Yeah.
Because he is undermining faith in science and public health. Children will die because of what he's going to say and do. So it's his agenda setting power, almost more than his administrative power that is already doing damage.
But let me play the devil's
Yeah,
advocate, because for the health part, it looks like he's a little bit zany and he got information mostly from conspiracy theorists. But how about food administration part? Because I can attest, coming from Europe, that the food here is more chemical and transformed, and though we have such supervising bodies, there's not too much disclosure
yeah,
towards consumer what's in the food, and obviously, the food here provokes obesity and cancer, and
yeah.
there's not enough control. So, whoever the director of such an institution might be, a Republican or a Democrat, can they really fight the economic interests of big producers of food?
Yes, they can. Uh, and hopefully he will. Like I said at the beginning, I think a lot of what he says about overprocessed foods is spot on. I'm not sure we should ban Doritos or mayonnaise. I'm not a huge mayonnaise fan, but I don't know if you ban them. Seems a bit I also like Peruvian food, and Peruvians put a lot of mayonnaise in their food, so I'm not sure I want to hate on all of that. But the Food and Drug Administration's mandate is set by Congress, and it's whether or not drugs are safe and effective, and I think whether or not food is just actively not really awful for you, like don't eat nails. And the ingredients do, in fact, have to be listed. And there is a tremendous amount of information available to the American consumer about what's in their food. They don't care, and they don't know what a lot of the words mean. None of you go grocery shopping for cookies thinking, "Oh, what's the percentage of the cookies?" Like you're not mistaking this for a healthy diet. But I think Congress determines what the rules are, not the commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Right.
All the FDA does is enforce Congress's rules.
Okay. So, and the congressmen are stipended by different interests, right?
Right. Well, those special interests are their constituents,
Right.
right? So yes, they're special interests who do things like own farms, right? Like we're not going to. I try to avoid corn syrup. Natural sugars are fine. I try to avoid corn syrup, but I recognize that corn syrup comes from corn, which is grown by farmers, right? Those are entire economies for huge chunks of the United States, right? So every time that somebody who lives and works in downtown DC, who grew up in a city, who spent his life living in Washington, Los Angeles, London, Phoenix, says, "Oh my gosh, all that food that's coming from farmers, that's coming from people across Illinois, Kansas, Iowa, whole economies." So yes, we should eat better, but we should also recognize that there's a whole lot more going on than
Yes.
a
Yes.
snot-nosed college professor in Washington, D.C. shouting from his whatever this is, his
Just
office.
one personal thing before I ask the very last question. One observation: when I took my daughters for the first time to Europe, we were going as collaborating with somebody from Germany for some piece of research, and they were saying they were observing as little kids eating German food,
Yeah,
meatballs, so much tastiness. My
yeah.
8-year-old daughter was telling me. So she was comparing the food in the United States that was tasteless versus the very
So,
tasty food and more natural in Germany. So
so do you have access to higher quality meatballs where you are? Like, are there farmers markets? Are there local farmers from whom you could buy?
there's more like the international store.
Okay, so is that where you shop?
Most of the well, when I have the time, because I have to go the distance and so on and so forth.
I see. So we do have the food. You just choose to not buy it.
Well, I buy from Aldi's also, sometimes from I don't know, whatever is closer, because I don't.
Right. What I'm suggesting is that yes, I'm going to I'm going to Madrid on Saturday for a week, and I'm going to be in the Basque Country in a few weeks. And oh my God, I'm not a foodie in the US. It's just calories. When I
Yes,
go to Bilbao, I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing food. But
yes,
I would also note that if people wanted access to that really good food and they could afford it, they would buy it.
yes.
And
I
they
understand.
don't.
It's thank you very much for it seems that we are out of time. I wanted to ask Emily's question with how did you get your foot in the door working in political advising, because that's helpful for our students.
I showed up.
Okay.
That sounds ridiculous, Emily, but find some local official who you believe in at any level and say, or some candidate, local candidate, I don't care who it is, local, small race, small staff, and say, my name's Emily Rosenthal. I'm a whatever graduating senior or a sophomore or grad student at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. I believe in what you're doing. Can I help? And they'll say, I don't know. Of course you can help. What do you have in mind? I've noticed your social media game isn't where it could be. I would like to jump on social media piece. Here's what I plan to do. And they'll say, that's great. I don't need to be on social media, but now that you mention it, I need some help with the press. Can you call a reporter for me? Show up and keep showing up. If I can count on you, if you're reliable, if you're bright, think critically and communicate clearly, you will move up the ranks really, really quickly. And you will make a difference in Edwardsville or Springfield or Chicago or wherever it is you're from. And you can change lives. Just show up.
Okay, thank you very, very much for your time. And one last observation. I'm looking at the posters that you have in the back over there. I see that you got a good price for dumb luck.
Secret of my success, dumb luck and minor tactical errors.
Okay, have a good day.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.